This is an image that came out of the city of Bucha, in war-torn Ukraine. We can see people standing next to a narrow table, crowded with dozens of cell phones plugged into a maze of power strips. What is striking about this picture is the apparent fragility of the most basic infrastructure, which we, people who observe this terrible war from afar, take for granted. In fact, much sooner than these people will charge their phones, this very photo will likely become viral on our phones as part of a TikTok compilation or a Twitter post. Remarkable discrepancy, isn't it? It's a comment about the world where internet platforms and the brutality of war converge. A world that is at once far removed and cybernetically present as a witness to this atrocity. A question is therefore raised. Do information technologies today make us more present when it comes to witnessing the reality of war? In other words, what does it mean to bear witness to the most viral war in history? The first TikTok war. What is on TV today?
The armed forces of the United States began an operation at the direction of the President to force Saddam Hussein to withdraw his troops from Kuwait and to end his occupation of that country.
When Jean Baudrillard was writing about the Gulf War, he was not describing just a regular war where two combating powers fight each other on an equal footing. Instead, he was describing a TV war. That is to say, he was writing about a war that, as far as he was concerned, did not take place outside of a television screen. As Baudrillard's main argument goes, the Gulf War only existed in the media space, where it was displayed more like a Nintendo game than a real war. It was presented in vivid colors, saturated with high-definition audio, spectacular tracking shots, bomb-nose camera footage, and heart-wrenching storylines. For Baudrillard, the employment of such techniques proved that the Gulf War was presented or manifested as a media event rather than a real brutal war. The separateness between the real war and the virtual war is the underlying problem of Baudrillard's philosophy. Baudrillard writes, "Our virtual has definitely overtaken the actual, and we must be content with extreme virtuality which deters any passage to action." Here, Baudrillard is describing a postmodern reality, so to say, wherein the horror of war was being actively deterred by a TV spectacle, a Hollywood script that was propped up by a collection of eloquent actors, journalists, and military experts. Baudrillard continues, "We are no longer in the logic of the passage from the virtual to actual, but in the hyper-realist logic of the deterrence of the real by the virtual." Indeed, if you take a look at the TV coverage of the Gulf War, what you will immediately see is a clean war.
Operation Desert Storm has been going according to plan.
The aim was to portray the war as clinical and bloodless, with so-called smart bombs making surgical strikes.
Clean war, or as Baudrillard would call it, a hyper-real war, where dazzling pictures of weaponry and discussions about that weaponry obfuscated the fact that in actuality territories were lost and hundreds of thousands of people actually died. This is precisely the way in which the reality was made impotent by the virtual representation. Brutality and chaos of the war simply did not appear on the television screen. We should probably stop here. Obviously the Gulf War did take place. To say otherwise would be absolute madness. The amount of high explosives unleashed during the first month of the Gulf War exceeded that of the entire Allied air offensive in the World War II. Just imagine the level of destruction and death that we're talking about here. That said, Baudrillard's argument, however brazen and careless it may seem, nonetheless stands. The way we perceive a war, say through a CNN's broadcast programming, obfuscates our perception of the reality of the war. War as a territorial event, where bombs are dropped and people are killed, ceases to exist as the power to create such a terrible crisis merges with the power to direct a movie about it. To put it simply, the medium through which we perceive the war shapes the way our culture will understand and remember it. This idea was already foreshadowed by Walter Benjamin in his famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, where he wrote the following: "The manner in which human perception is organized, the medium in which it is accomplished, is determined not only by nature, but by historical circumstances as well." So, if Baudrillard is right, our perception of the Gulf War was mostly organized by the broadcast programming of the 90s. Now, as we are presented with totally different historical circumstances, the question arises: how does social media revolution affect the way in which we perceive the war in Ukraine?
There have been a number of reports of Scud missiles, but...
Certainly, one can observe the war in Ukraine through many different mediums, but there's a reason why this war is often called, if not the first social media war, but at least the most viral war, or perhaps the first TikTok war? Social media platforms not only changed the way this war is chronicled, experienced, and understood, but more importantly, they, in many cases, changed the course of war itself. Therefore, instead of a media war, as it was described by Baudrillard, what we are now dealing with is a different kind of an atrocity, where information itself has been turned into a weapon. In short, we're now dealing with a cybernetic war. The difference between Baudrillard's TV war and cyber war is made apparent by the fact that, in the case of the war in Ukraine, no single entity has a monopoly over the flow of information. There is, in other words, no single media outlet, such as CNN during the Gulf War, that could possibly monopolize the virtual representation of the war. Instead, what we have now is a multitude of simultaneously fought cybernetic conflicts that span economic, political, social, as well as military forms of war. Mikhailo Fedorov, Ukraine's Minister of Digital Transformation, admitted as much when he said that internet platforms can be used as instruments for the government to achieve wartime aims. This type of war, a cyber war, was already predicted by the Pentagon's think tank at the RAND Corporation in 1993. In the revolutionary article "Cyber War is Coming," researchers claim that future conflicts will be won not by physical forces, but by the availability and manipulation of information. The authors of the article go even further by claiming that in the future, cyber war will be accompanied by a net war, the purpose of which will be to disrupt, damage, or modify what a target population knows or think it knows about itself and the world around it. This does not, however, mean that cyber war concerns a propaganda campaign launched over the internet. It means that online information itself needs to be understood as a weapon that can be used to dismantle and manipulate realities. So, let's discuss information as a weapon. How does one make information into an effective weapon during a war? Here, I would like to quickly discuss Tiziana Terranova's 2004 book Network Culture, where, among other things, she undertakes to define the meaning of information within the network or cyber culture. To build her argument, Terranova first discusses the work of telecommunication researchers of the 20th century, for whom the definition of information was rather simple. Information was fundamentally concerned with the accurate reproduction of an encoded signal. For example, if there's a sender who's transmitting a message to a receiver, information is precisely that content which passes through the channel. So I send you a code, you distinguish it from noise, and thus information takes shape. However, as Terranova points out, contemporary network culture has dramatically changed the meaning of information, in that the relationship between a sender and a receiver and the content transmitted between them has been rendered absolutely insignificant. Network culture, in other words, is too diffused and disorganized. All information loses its intended meaning as soon as millions of receivers begin to interpret and manipulate it. Indeed, advanced technologies equip people with an ability to produce and receive data simultaneously, thereby establishing a data-saturated milieu, a social environment of mass data consumption. As Terranova writes, the production of information therefore is an operational problem, dominated by the imperatives of the channel and the code, rather than by a concern with the exchange of ideas, ethical truth, or rhetorical confrontation. It is not about science, says Terranova, but about signals. In other words, information becomes an effective weapon not by virtue of its content, but by virtue of its virality, the capacity to spread quickly through the information milieu. As the most viral war in history, the war in Ukraine has shown us time and time again how information can be used as a weapon, that is, to spur rapid shifts in public opinion. Just think of the selfie-style video that Volodymyr Zelensky shot at the beginning of the war. He stands outside Kyiv's government quarter in dim light, pointing the camera at himself and several senior officials. "We are all here," he declares. You probably remember this video. A Ukrainian woman approaches a group of Russian soldiers and tells them to put sunflower seeds in their pockets so that something useful will grow from their bodies when they die. Have you seen this? Tractors towing abandoned Russian tanks. A global meme if there ever was one. At this point, probably everyone heard the audio of Ukrainian soldiers at an islet in the Black Sea telling an approaching fleet, Russian warship, "Go fuck yourself." Have you seen this? A Ukrainian soldier moonwalking? Most of these are instances of spontaneous reactions to the grotesque, dehumanizing reality of Russian aggression. That's precisely what makes such digital media powerful. It superimposes a hopeful, unique human sentiment onto the chaos and brutality of war. It helps to release built-up anger and frustration. That said, there's another type of audiovisual content that fills everyone's social media: explicit documentation of the brutality of war. You probably have seen this, one of the first truly viral photos of the war in Ukraine, taken by Tyler Hicks. Here we see a dead soldier lying on the ground in front of the disabled tank, his body covered in fresh snow. A TikTok video that shows images and video clips of missiles falling over Kiev, set quite bizarrely to a song by MGMT. A Ukrainian father says a tearful goodbye to his family. Or this, a photo taken by Lindsay Adario of a Ukrainian family that was killed by mortar fire as they tried to escape the fighting near Irpin. At this point, we can see quite clearly how internet platforms present the reality of war as a scattershot, chaotic bits and pieces of digital media, no matter whether it's content related to the land invasion in Europe, or a video of a funny cat, or perhaps an ad for a toothbrush. All content on the internet follows a similar law of motion. The algorithms that enable optimized functionality of internet platforms simply do not discriminate against the type, genre, provenance, or quality of the content shown. Whatever is engaging becomes more popular. Remember what Terranova wrote? It is not about science, but about signals. Considering that social media platforms are quite adept at displaying a cacophony of media related and at times absolutely unrelated to the war, how does it affect our understanding of the reality of war? In Baudrillard's terms, does the abundance and immediacy of media about the war allow us to finally move past the barrier of virtual representation? So, does social media bring us closer to the reality of war? In answering this question, I would first like to discuss Susan Sontag's analysis of war photography in her book Regarding the Pain of Others. Here, Sontag analyzes the ways in which, throughout history, photographs influenced the public's perception of atrocities. After all, as she writes, photography of an atrocity may give rise to opposing responses: a call for peace, a cry for revenge, or simply the bemused awareness that terrible things happen. Whatever the reaction to war photography may ultimately be, Sontag stresses that photography has a unique power in steering the public's opinion about the war. This is true because a photo is ultimately a record of the real, incontrovertible, as no verbal account, however impartial, could be, since a machine is doing the recording. This is why, as she points out, protests against the Vietnam War were, for the most part, mobilized by images. Similarly, the photos of Sarajevo under siege made the world realize that it's about time something would be done about the war in Bosnia. That said, there is, as Sontag rightly admits, a multitude of critics who are quite skeptical of the power of war photography in the contemporary context. These critics claim that now we live in a world that is hypersaturated with images, and for this reason, those images that should matter have a diminishing effect. We have, the argument goes, become callous. In fact, Sontag herself argued something similar to this. In her book on photography, she admitted that while images can make an event more real, they can, after repeated exposure, also make that same event less real. However, at the time Sontag is writing regarding the Pain of Others book, she is already quite skeptical of this argument. Sontag in this book writes, "What is the evidence that photographs have a diminishing impact? That our culture of spectatorship neutralizes the moral force of photographs of atrocities? Sure, a lot of people these days are less capable of paying attention to images of war, because these images, let's be frank, are a very common occurrence. However, this point only proves that people are overstimulated, bemused, or perhaps indifferent. It doesn't say anything about the capacity of war images to deliver the moral force of reality. This is precisely why Sontag critiques such thinkers as Guy Debord and Jean Baudrillard, who tend to generalize the postmodern society as one where mass-produced cultural spectacles make the reality of any atrocity absolutely inaccessible. Such logic, as Sontag claims, is pretentious and lazy nonsense. The overgeneralization of people's inability to respond to the sufferings of others, firstly, says Sontag, suggests that there is no real suffering in the world, and secondly, it privileges the perspective of those that live in well-off, protected countries, where people have the luxury to be just spectators. In light of this, Sontag reminds the reader that there are hundreds of millions of television watchers who are far from insured to what they see on television. These people do not have the luxury of patronizing reality. Thus, it is quite important for Sontag to stress that it's only our sense of reality that is being eroded today. This could seem quite absurd, but she nonetheless reminds the reader that there is still a reality that exists independent of the attempts to weaken its authority. For this reason, every attempt to overgeneralize people's inability to respond to the suffering of others should be seen as an ill-advised or perhaps even callous attempt at responding to the problem of media oversaturation with violence. The problem, after all, is that reality, due to the abundance of such media, is often ignored, forgotten, which would imply that our priority today should be, as Sontag writes, to defend reality and the imperiled standards for responding more fully to it. We need to, in other words, train ourselves to respond more adequately to the reality as we are presented with it. As I will discuss in the last part of this video, in the times of cyber warfare, this becomes a remarkably hard undertaking. Sontag's logic suggests that the media about an atrocity requires us to put a little bit more work into our response. Oversaturation of war photography does not diminish its innate capacity to impart reality. To dig deeper into this argument, I would now like to turn my attention to Paul Virilio, a philosopher whose sustained analysis of the question of technology, especially in the context of virtualization of war, is simply unavoidable. You probably know Virilio as a thinker of speed. In fact, he's often referred to as a practitioner of the science of speed, or dramology. In other words, Virilio's goal in many of his writings is to see how speed, as it is accommodated by technological progress, shapes the way we experience social, political, and military space. Acceleration for Virilio is the main motivation of all societal progress. Whether it's transport, communication, or military technology, people have always sought to capture territories, knowledge, and thus power as fast and as decisively as possible. Speed is what motivated us to move from horse-drawn locomotion, from railway and telephones to electric cars, television, digital technology, and finally, yes, to cybernetic war, which we view on social media. So our original question persists. How does the speed with which social media delivers the audiovisual representation of war affect our comprehension of the reality of war? Well, in my opinion, we should interpret internet platforms as vision machines, a term that is used quite often in Virilio's work. In his view, vision machines are technical prostheses that allow us to extend the manner in which we see. They allow us to increase the speed of our visual apprehension, so to say. Well, you might say, that's good. Internet platforms as visual machines extend the manner in which we see the reality of war. Not quite, actually. Virilio claims that these vision machines only give us an impression of accelerated, extended knowledge, while at the same time separating us further away from the complexity, richness, and even randomness, essential attributes of the visceral experience of space and temporality. Virilio writes, the increasing disequilibrium between direct information and indirect information, itself a result of diverse means of communication, tends excessively to privilege mediatized information to the detriment of that of the senses. Here, Virilio is not so much describing people's inability to react appropriately to indirect information provided by, say, social media platforms, as he's making a point about the failure of vision machines to deliver a real sensory experience. That is to say, things that are distant can, with the help of internet platforms, seem to us immediately present, or telepresent, as Virilio would say it. This is a problem because such presence at a distance changes the very way we see something that is real. When we see something like an explosion in the outskirts of Kiev through the screen of a smartphone, we fail, the argument goes, to experience it as a material and spatial extension of our bodies. After all, if we were actually exposed to a major danger like that, we would inevitably develop some conscious and unconscious habits that would help us protect our bodies. Consider Ukrainian philosophers Volodymyr Yermolenko's account of how people's daily life, their sensory experience of it, has changed as they were all of a sudden exposed to a permanent danger of shelling.
Well, a lot of things have changed very quickly in our understanding. Things have changed their meaning. For example, a window is no longer a window because you'd better not approach to the windows, people say, because if there is a shelling, you can be wounded by the glass of the window. The light is no longer the light because the light can be dangerous if the air strikes, so you better switch off the lights when you're in the evening, for example. Therefore, when you're traveling through Kiev right now on car, and I do it regularly, you are traveling in the dark streets, so the lights from the streets are switched off, so you kind of are in a very dark place, which never happened before, of course. And if you enter, sometimes I several times took some families, volunteered to get them out of the city, and then we went to other villages, for example, and when there is dark, the villages are completely dark. There are no lights in the houses because people are, very careful enough not to give signs to artillery or to airstrikes, to jets, Russian jets, that there are villages. So the meaning of things have changed.
This account clearly shows that by observing the war through a vision machine, say a smartphone, we cannot possibly experience it as an extension of our bodies. Hence, even after we are exposed to audiovisual proof of shelling, for us windows remain windows, the light remains the light. Objects that we touch and use retain the same meaning as before, because quite obviously we're not in danger. However, the argument that technology fails to deliver a real sensory experience, while important, seems a bit too obvious and extremely unhelpful. In my opinion, it should be understood merely as a provocation, a pessimistic argument about the failure of our contemporary society to experience the world without any kind of technological prosthesis. Indeed, it would be quite ridiculous to think that virtual transparency of an atrocity is bad simply because it is not actually a real, unmediated experience of an atrocity. Do we want more people to be frightened to death? I don't think so. This is where Virilio's pessimistic argument about vision machines falls short. It's merely a provocation whose main goal is to draw the reader's attention to the ways in which people's obsession with technology and speed fails us. In the light of this, Sontag's critique yet again seems quite appropriate. Neither the technology's failure to deliver a sensory experience of an atrocity to the viewer, nor the viewer's ignorance of the reality of an atrocity can change the fact that atrocities like the war in Ukraine are happening right now, at this very moment. The purpose of vision machines is therefore a rather modest one. It is to bear witness to the war in Ukraine. Nothing more, nothing less. It is up to us then, the viewers, to interpret as adequately as we possibly can the horrifying reality of Russian aggression against Ukraine. Internet platforms are thus an imperfect chronicle of wartime, where gruesome audiovisual journalism will inevitably coexist with uplifting memes, toothpaste ads, and funny videos about cats. In ending this video, I would like to, yet again, quote Sontag.
Citizens of modernity, consumers of violence as spectacle, adepts of proximity without risk, are schooled to be cynical about the possibility of sincerity. Some people will do anything to keep themselves from being moved.